In August 1945, a motion picture camera crew enters the city of Hiroshima, Japan, to record startling images of the first city devastated by an atomic bomb. There were those who said that Hiroshima would remain uninhabitable, forever poisoned by radiation, and that those who were exposed to the bomb would all be dead within 3 years. What has become of the Hiroshima survivors?
This series presents information based in part on theory and conjecture. The producer's purpose is to suggest some possible explanations, but not necessarily the only ones, to the mysteries we will examine.
On July 16, 1945, a signal flare illuminates the barren New Mexico desert as scientists anxiously await the detonation of the world's first atomic weapon. For President Truman, the inevitable dilemma: should the weapon be used against Japan? Believing that it will bring a speedy end to World War II and the savings of millions of lives, the president issues the order: drop the bomb. In the early morning of August 6th, a B-29 named the Enola Gay departs the Pacific island of Tinian en route to Japan. Her payload, a single 5-ton bomb nicknamed Little Boy. The mood in Hiroshima that morning was one of uneasy anticipation. While other Japanese cities were being leveled by American bombers, Hiroshima remained unchanged, and no one in Japan could understand why.
Some thought Hiroshima was being spared because it was too beautiful to bomb. They thought the Americans were saving it to build villas there. Others speculated that a relative of President Truman's, perhaps even his mother, was living in the city, and that's why the city was being spared. Yet there were those who foresaw the real reason. Hiroshima was being reserved for a special, highly destructive weapon.
Many survivors remember seeing the B-29 over Hiroshima that morning, but paid it little heed. And few could see a small, shiny object falling from the plane. Kaz Suishi was an American of Japanese descent living in Hiroshima at the time of the bomb. She was 2 miles from the bomb's hypocenter.
It was a beautiful blue sky that morning. I heard the sound of the plane and I looked up and saw the B-29. I was not concerned because the B-29 used to come every single day, but it never dropped bombs. I thought it was beautiful. It looked like a silver angel. Then after the B-29 was gone, there was still a little dot, a tiny little dot falling to the ground. At first I thought it was a parachute, and I thought how brave the American must be to parachute into the city.
During the 43 seconds it took for the bomb to fall to Earth, most of the inhabitants of Hiroshima weren't even aware they were in any danger, and none could imagine the devastation that was to follow. In an instant, the city of Hiroshima, Japan, was obliterated. metal fused with stone, sand turned to glass. It was as if the sun had come in contact with the earth. Every structure within a 2-mile radius of the bomb's hypocenter was destroyed. Another Hiroshima survivor is Florence Yamada Garnett. She was 13 years old at the time and lost most of her family in the explosion. It is only recently that she has been able to talk about her experiences.
Next thing you knew, the building was falling on top of you. There was a pressure like somebody was just stepping all over you. And then the heat. After the explosion of the bomb, you can feel the heat. You suck in the air and you think you're dying. I was rolled across a schoolyard. That's about all I remember at the time.
The temperature near the center of the blast was so great, human beings literally evaporated, leaving behind, in some cases, nothing but their shadows etched into stone and concrete. No one is certain how many were killed in the blast. Conservative estimates put the figure at 70,000, with many thousands more to die in the weeks and months to follow. Within days, medical personnel attempt to treat the tens of thousands of seriously injured. Severe burns and mutilations are so numerous, medical facilities so primitive, that most of the severely injured have little chance at all for survival. As one doctor puts it, Hiroshima is a sea of dead and dying.
You could see people running out of the city, skin hanging, some burned to look like charred, but they were still moving. I remember seeing people just sitting or standing, charred to death. I recall a man that was on a bicycle that was still leaning against a bridge, and another person taking the body off of the bike and then riding the bike away. I thought it was cruel at that time, but of course, it's survival for yourself.
As horrible as their experiences have been, many of the survivors are soon to learn more terror is to confront them. Within days and weeks, the survivors begin to notice in themselves a strange, insidious form of illness. The survivors attribute the symptoms to A-bomb disease. They are actually the effects of acute atomic radiation never experienced before. One man who understands the terror of radiation poisoning is Dr. Robert J. Lifton, a psychiatrist who has spent several years in Hiroshima and has interviewed numerous atomic bomb survivors.
Well, with most wars and with the use of conventional weapons, you kill people. Then both sides bury their dead. They then return to life as usual. Oh, they grieve and there's pain, but life goes on in the old-fashioned way. In Hiroshima, the bomb was dropped, and that was the beginning of lifelong effects. For instance, days, weeks, months after the bomb was dropped, and sometimes in people who seemed unaffected by the bomb, to have no marks on their bodies, they would suddenly find themselves having weird symptoms, very grotesque symptoms, bleeding from all of their bodily openings, bleeding into the skin, severe diarrhea, bloody diarrhea, extreme weakness, high fever, and when white blood counts could be taken, very high white blood counts, extreme weakness, and in many cases death. If people lived a little longer, other grotesque symptoms would follow, such as their hair falling out. Now, these were the symptoms of acute radiation effects. Nobody understood this at the time. They simply sensed that there was some kind of poison in the bomb. And the people in Hiroshima began to feel that this is a weapon that leaves behind poison in your bones, and that poison may strike you down at any time.
The first thing we would do is get up in the morning and look at your forearm, and if you didn't have any purple spots, that means you were going to live for a couple of days. With me, as I said, I went through the radiation sickness of vomiting, nausea, dehydration, complete loss of hair. But I was one of the lucky ones to survive. This was the first thing you would do in the morning is look at your arm, comb your hair, and it starts falling out. You feel your time is coming very soon. There was no panic about it. It was just an everyday reality at the time. However, the people who are not exposed to the bomb directly were very hesitant in going back into the city. By that time, we had heard there was a different type of a bomb, that if you were exposed to the bomb, you may not live.
Within weeks, the survivors of Hiroshima begin the lengthy and burdensome task of rebuilding. Unknown to them, the effects of the bomb would haunt them for years to come in ways they could not imagine. When an atomic bomb explodes, it produces heat, light, and blast effects. In addition, there is the emission of invisible rays of atomic matter that bombard everything within the blast area. These invisible rays, referred to as radiation, have the capability of penetrating the human body. In small doses, certain types of radiation, like that used frequently in medical diagnosis, is believed to be harmless. But in massive amounts, like that experienced at Hiroshima, the results can be deadly. Penetrating the human body, radiation strikes deep within the cells our bodies are made of. When a damaged cell reproduces itself, instead of dividing to produce a new healthy cell, it manufactures an identically damaged cell. This type of growth, which frequently takes years to surface, leads to the disease we call cancer. Scientists had been aware of the harmful effects of radiation for some time and wanted to determine how much of it had been received in Hiroshima. Human bone fragments, one of the materials that best retains radiation, were collected at various locations in the city for analysis later. The early findings revealed that a large amount of highly toxic beta and gamma radiation had been dispersed throughout the city at the time of the explosion. What effect this would have on the Hiroshima survivors was still unknown. All that was certain was that many of the survivors, even those who seemed unscathed by the bomb, were carrying within their bodies the potential for great harm that would not reveal itself for years to come. Dr. Stuart Finch has recently concluded a 34-year investigation into the delayed effects of radiation exposure.
Major findings early were the occurrence of increased cataracts in the lenses of the eyes, and then the increased occurrence of leukemia, which in the heavily exposed population reached a peak rate of about 40 times the normal rate. Concomitantly, there's been an increased rise in cancer rates in Hiroshima, particularly cancer of the stomach, cancer of the thyroid, cancer of the lung, breast cancer, and most recently the occurrence of multiple myeloma, which is a form of bone cancer. I think it is safe to say that there has been a definite relationship established between the occurrence of exposure in these survivors and the occurrence of cancer.
The effects of radiation can remain hidden for generations. When sex cells are radiated, the victims may remain in perfect health, but pass on genetic damage to their offspring. When hundreds of exposed women who were pregnant at the time of the explosion gave birth to defective children, it created widespread fears of permanent genetic damage. But the damage suffered by children in the womb was the result of direct exposure to radiation. not genetic inheritance. Nonetheless, fears of genetic damage continued for years until Hiroshima had been rebuilt and thousands of healthy children were born to Hiroshima survivors. Today, most authorities conclude that the genetic threat from radiation in Hiroshima is much smaller than previously believed. One man who thinks differently is Dr. Gerald Hirsch of the Wadsworth Medical Center in Los Angeles.
The most recent studies indicate little or few long-term genetic effects for radiation. One recent study indicated that only one child out of 12,000 children of radiation-exposed Japanese had a mutation. However, several years ago, we developed a test that we thought would pick up a majority of mutations. The test uses just an ounce of blood and involves the purification of the oxygen-carrying protein of red cells. Many of the radiation-exposed people had an abnormal value in this test. These data indicate that the mutation rate for radiation may be much higher than we previously thought, perhaps as much as 1,000 times higher.
If Dr. Hirsch's findings are correct, it would mean that seemingly healthy children could be carrying genetic damage that might not reveal itself for generations.
We're not sure, though, how many of the mutations measured by this test will have bad effects in future generations.
A single bomb devastated a city and left its survivors with lifelong suffering. How deep are the scars of Hiroshima?
Nuclear weapons are radically different from ordinary bombs. If you compare, for instance, the destruction of Tokyo to that of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, well, Tokyo was completely destroyed. More people were killed in Tokyo than were killed in Hiroshima or Nagasaki. But it took thousands of bombs, over hours of saturation bombing to do that to Tokyo. In Hiroshima, a single bomb dropped from a single plane destroyed an entire city. Now that created in survivors in Hiroshima the sense of a sudden and absolute shift from normal existence to an overwhelming encounter with death. They suddenly found themselves in the midst of a sea of dead and dying, and they walked about in a daze, like people in a dream, as they described it, not really knowing whether they were dead or alive. Now, one imagines that in the midst of disaster, people are panic-stricken, running around, screaming. That's not the way it was in Hiroshima. Rather, they walked around quietly, as in a silent movie, very muted, very still. And when you see the films of those early days, that's the kind of faces that you see. That's also psychic numbing. Their minds are shut down, they're muted. It's a defense against ordinary or normal degrees of feeling because one simply couldn't permit oneself ordinary forms of feeling and suffering, ordinary psychological pain, to those influences and still remain sane.
The psychological pain suffered in Hiroshima still exists today.
I guess it was about 10 years ago when I had a fire in the house. There was a time when, at that time, I couldn't separate Hiroshima and present. And that was, as weird as it sounds, it was very true. I became very hysterical, which I wasn't hysterical during the Hiroshima fire. I could not separate Hiroshima and present. I had to stay off of work for about a month. And the doctors did not know what to do with me. I didn't realize that it was a common, would you call it neurosis or whatever it was that happened. We're finding about more of those things now.
Hundreds of Hiroshima survivors now live in the United States, in areas like Little Tokyo in Los Angeles. Most do not want to be identified. They feel a sense of shame and embarrassment in being a survivor. It has been through the efforts of people like Paul Tsunishi of the Japanese American League that the plight of the Hiroshima survivor is now emerging into the open. Various Japanese groups have organized radiation seminars held in major American cities.
We are bringing a program, a public forum to you today.
At this one, held recently in Los Angeles, the public learns that the effects of Hiroshima are still being felt, more than 35 years after the bomb.
I am a victim and a survivor of the atomic bomb.
The specific problems are medical insurance, their inability to get insurance, or if they have insurance, they don't want the carriers to know it. And they're not sure what will happen if it becomes known that they are survivors of radiation from before. Additionally, there's a question of getting and maintaining jobs because they might be ostracized because of that. And there's a social stigma of being ostracized from the larger group.
For Kaz Sawishi, the seminar reawakens tragic memories. The photographed images of a devastated Hiroshima will never be forgotten by those who see them. In a matter of seconds, a city was destroyed. Yet its legacy may last forever, perhaps making all of us Hiroshima survivors.
If a bomb were dropped today, there would be no outside world, nobody there to help. There would be no recovery.
Houdini called himself the master mystifier of the age, the undisputed king of handcuffs. No ropes could bind him, no icy waters drown him. Imprisoned in chains or suspended in straitjackets, Houdini emerged from every restraint. Though denying he had supernatural powers, he spent his life in pursuit of death and hoped to communicate from beyond the grave. What were the secrets of the great Houdini?
This series presents information based in part on theory and conjecture. The producer's purpose is to suggest some possible explanations, but not necessarily the only ones, to the mysteries we will examine.
The great Houdini died on Halloween 1926. In death, he remains as enigmatic as he was in life. For years, he visited spiritual mediums and seances, seeking proof of life after death. And shortly before he died, he promised to send word from the beyond, if he could. Houdini was perhaps the best-known escape artist of all time. From the beginning, he was surrounded by mystery. Born Eric Weiss in Hungary in 1874, he would later claim Wisconsin as his birthplace. He was a restless child who rarely slept. His only consolation, the beat of his mother's heart. It became the driving rhythm of his life, an affirmation that all was well, even through difficult times. Magic fascinated young Eric, and provided escape from a life of hardship. Already captivated by sleight-of-hand masters, he happened upon a book that would change his existence. The life story and secrets of France's greatest conjurer, Robert Houdin. Taking Houdin's illusions and adopting his name, Eric became Houdini the Magician. These simple props, now in a museum, were among the first that he could afford as he struggled to survive in an already overcrowded field. In an attempt to appear successful, he dubbed himself the King of Cards. While playing beer halls on Coney Island, Harry fell in love with a beautiful young singer. Her name was Beatrice Ronner. Harry called her Bess. She was part of an act called the Floral Sisters, and just 18. Although Harry was Jewish and Bess Catholic, their romance blossomed. Despite her family's objections, within weeks she would become Mrs. Harry Houdini and join his act. The highlight of their show became a disappearing trick called Metamorphosis, in which Harry and Bess would exchange places inside a bag, inside a trunk, in 3 seconds. Although audiences were intrigued by the illusion, it was not unique, and Harry would continue to seek new tricks. Handcuff escapes were common entertainment, though the audiences knew that performers used phony cuffs. But Harry practiced with real ones every night. He developed the locksmith's mastery of what became a huge collection and could escape from every cuff. Still, the audiences were unimpressed, so Houdini searched for a more challenging restraint. He found it in the straitjacket. After seeing an inmate at an insane asylum struggling futilely in such a device, Houdini was inspired to incorporate the stunt into his act. This rare piece of film documents his entire escape in less than 3 minutes. Yet even with the straitjacket, Houdini's climb to vaudeville fame seemed agonizingly slow. He despaired being at the bottom of the bill, below such acts as the tiniest triplets ever born. Desperate for publicity, he dared police to try to lock him in their cuffs. The challenge would become his trademark. Houdini expert and owner of many of his handcuffs is amateur magician Sid Radner.
Houdini didn't invent the handcuff escape act, but he did perfect it. Unlike his competitors and the people who preceded him, Houdini took on all comers. Every sheriff, every chief of police, every deputy, everybody from anywhere could bring in handcuffs, ordinary handcuffs, bring them up on the stage. They had to be in good working order, and as long as they were in good working order, Houdini would accept the challenge and he would proceed to get out of these handcuffs, ordinary handcuffs, just as these are here.
Finally, Houdini's skill caught the attention of a major vaudeville booker, and he and Bess started a national tour. They were paid $120 a week. For publicity, Houdini added jailbreaks to his repertoire, allowing police to strip and search him before locking him in a cell. Minutes later, Houdini would appear free, unfettered, and fully clothed. It was not until he toured Europe that he achieved the fame he had dreamed of. Success would stretch his tour to 4 years. France paid homage to the King of Cuffs. German theaters begged him to extend his tour. And in Russia, he freed himself from a Siberian paddy wagon. But escaping from bonds of rope and steel were not enough. To generate bigger audiences for his stage shows, he risked a drowning death. Houdini yearned to share his success with his now widowed mother. So he sent for her in Budapest, and giving her a gown designed for the late Queen Victoria, presented her like royalty to relatives and old family friends. Triumphantly, he returned to America as a vaudeville headliner, earning $1,200 a week. Drumming up business in each new town with increasingly hazardous stunts, it now seemed as though nothing could hold him. It was impossible for audiences to understand how he could survive in a box, in the dark, underwater, for 4 minutes. Only the few close to him knew how he picked locks with his toes and even dislocated his joints to escape. The crowds always wondered if this time Houdini would die. How often did he wonder himself? Death fascinated him, and he would frequently hire a local photographer to take his picture by a famous tombstone. He even arranged a stunt in which he was buried alive 6 feet deep. The weight of the earth nearly suffocated him. He swore he'd never attempt it again. Houdini delighted in convincing his audience he was always just a breath away from death. No stunt achieved that better than the water torture cell. The audience was allowed to inspect the 100-gallon tank, but they could never detect a trick. Behind a drawn curtain, Houdini would somehow escape and then wait unseen as minutes passed. When the audience could bear the tension no longer, Houdini would emerge, breathless, to their immense relief. Some were so amazed by Houdini's prowess, they were sure he possessed paranormal abilities. Magic expert Walter Gibson discussed this issue with Houdini during their friendship in the 1920s.
The question has been raised about Houdini's approach to the supernatural. Many thought that he had mediumistic powers himself, and that he didn't want to advertise that fact, so he simply pretended that his escapes were normal things. So they thought that the reason that he enclosed himself in a cabinet was to get the darkness that would bring spirit aid, and that he actually would dematerialize from some of these contraptions in which he'd been placed.
The more successful Houdini became, the more his mother was proud of him. Ironically, his act grew so popular they rarely saw each other anymore. When he and Bess set sail for another European tour, Mama came to say her farewell. It was the last time they would see her alive. Devastated by the loss, Houdini would spend hours by her grave, hoping for a word from beyond. The vigil became an obsession that would change the course of his life. Houdini entered a period of intense mourning following the death of his mother. He edged his stationery in black and published elaborate tributes to her. After a year, he recovered from his grief and burst upon the American scene with renewed vigor and purpose. The public response was greater than ever as Houdini introduced a new twist to his straitjacket escape. Although it appeared more dangerous, Houdini would later admit the inverted position made his release simpler. In city after city, his genius for publicity drew huge crowds and packed the theaters night after night. Movies made his tricks even easier. Playing characters named Harvey Hanford and Harry Harper, the movies and serials featured the stunts that had made him famous. Within a few years, he formed his own motion picture company. The theme of his first movie was reincarnation, as Houdini comes back to life from an icy Arctic grave as the man from beyond. The plot of the movie nearly caused him disaster at Niagara Falls. Despite Houdini's safety precautions, the stunt almost killed him and his co-star. There are those who say he encouraged these brushes with death. Death and what lay beyond would always fascinate Houdini, for this was the barrier that separated him from his beloved mother. Trying to contact her became an obsession. During the 1920s, spiritualism was widespread, giving hope to the living that they could communicate with the dead. Mediums prospered in darkened seance rooms. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, author of Sherlock Holmes, was one of its major advocates. On tour in England, Houdini accompanied Doyle to over 100 seances, but still no messages came from his beloved mother. So great was Houdini's distress and disappointment that Lady Doyle volunteered to use her powers to contact the spirit of his mother. A seance was held, and Lady Doyle began writing in a trance, unaware of the words that flowed onto the paper. "Oh, my darling, thank God at last I am through. I want to talk to my boy, my own beloved boy. Now I can rest in peace." First moved by this demonstration, Houdini later rejected it. Why was a cross drawn when his mother was Jewish? Why was the letter in English when she spoke only German and Yiddish? If Lady Doyle couldn't contact her, could anyone? Walter Gibson recalls Houdini's turn against spiritualism.
Now, Houdini respected Conan Doyle, and he knew there were lots of believers of that type. But he also knew that psychic matters, spiritualistic seances, were studded with fakers. And he started out to expose the fakes.
Houdini and Bess knew all the tricks of the spooky trade. Billed in their struggling years as Professor Harry and Mademoiselle Beatrice, they faked spirit writing on a slate and did a phony mind-reading act. Now he attended seances disguised, exposing mediums in the course of their trickery. Soon he incorporated his debunking into his stage performance, demonstrating how bells were rung by spirits, how photographic negatives were tampered with to produce ghostly images, and how props were used to fake spirit voices.
Somebody would hold a trumpet. Houdini would stand away from the trumpet and whisper, and they didn't see him whisper, but they would catch these voices as though they came through the trumpet, and he showed how that was done. He explained several other spiritualistic tricks, but the one that was most impressive was the slate writing.
Houdini showed how a medium's accomplice would exchange a blank slate for one with writing, and how some mediums were so skilled they could write spirit messages with chalk between their toes. Houdini challenged mediums to prove their claims were real, and so did the prestigious journal The Scientific American, whose publishers asked him to join their investigation committee. A young medium known as Marjorie claimed to manifest a wide range of psychic phenomena. However, when Houdini devised a special box to prevent her from manipulating objects in the dark, the phenomena ceased. When she failed to collect the award, Marjorie predicted imminent doom for Houdini. As he began his September tour in 1926, Houdini himself had the premonition he would never see his home again. Strangely, Houdini did not die performing a dangerous stunt. While waiting backstage before a show, he was punched in the stomach by a young man who had heard of Houdini's legendary iron midriff. Unfortunately, Houdini was caught off guard and had not prepared himself for the blow. He suffered for a week from a ruptured appendix and peritonitis. He died on Halloween. Houdini was buried in a coffin he had purchased for his act, a stack of his mother's letters under his head. Ironically, even though Houdini was proud of all the spiritualist fakery he exposed, he never lost his hope that there was life after death. While he lay dying, he made a pact with Bess that if it were possible to communicate from the other side, he would do so. They agreed upon a code that would prove the message was really from him. The words that would reunite them were inspired by the song that had brought them together. Rosabelle, believe. Bess did believe and kept the light of hope burning in their home. Mediums claimed to make contact with Houdini, but the code words were never right. Finally, the agreed-upon message was produced by psychic Arthur Ford. Bess confirmed it at first, but later discovered there were ways he could have learned the code, ways that were not supernatural. On Halloween 1936, 10 years after Houdini's death, Bess and a circle of Houdini's friends met in Hollywood for a last seance. The event was recorded.
O thou disembodied spirits, we greet thee. It is the spirit of Houdini we wish to contact. Are you here, Houdini? Please manifest yourself in any way possible. We have waited, Houdini, oh, so long. Speak, speak, Harry. In the name of humanity and love, if there is communication from the great beyond, come through with the evidence. Speak, 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 speak.
The evidence did not come. Bess sadly closed her final seance.
My last hope is gone. I do not believe that Houdini can come back to me or to anyone. The Houdini shrine has burned for 10 years. I now reverently turn out the light. Good night, Harry.
Buried with Houdini was his hope that he could be contacted after death. Although Bess gave up, there are still those who try to reach him and dream that he may yet be the man from beyond. Although Houdini's will specified that all his illusions and theatrical props be destroyed after his brother's death, many of them have survived in private collections. At the Houdini Hall of Fame in Niagara Falls, Canada, 2 of his challenges still wait to be met. Since his death more than 50 years ago, no other magician has exactly duplicated his escape from the water torture cell. And within this envelope is a secret code. So far, no medium has come forth with the precise code words to prove communication with the dead. No one could be more pleased that the challenges continue than the great Houdini.
crave your attention for a few moments? Moments well spent, my friends, to show you something, a phenomenon, the like of which you may travel the old world over and never see again.
In London, in the 1880s, a strange, misshapen figure appeared in a small carnival sideshow.
The Elephant Man, a grotesque freak of human nature. And yet, he started out in life just like you and me. But one day, while visiting a traveling circus, his poor mother, a fine, delicate creature, 6 months with child, was terrified by a pachyderm. A elephant to you, sir. The consequence of this overwhelming misfortune I'm about to show you now. Don't let this wonderful educational opportunity pass you by. Would you kindly step this way, ladies and gentlemen? Thank you.
Who was the Elephant Man, and what caused his grotesque appearance?
This series presents information based in part on theory and conjecture. The producer's purpose is to suggest some possible explanations, but not necessarily the only ones, to the mysteries we will examine.
In the London of the 1880s, horse-drawn carriages of the rich were never to be seen in areas like Whitechapel Road, which was, as Dickens might have described it, filthy, festering, and overhung with the smell of decay. Tottering rows of blighted housing, an abundance of unwashed children, where the only escape was to be found in a bottle. Although the finest hospital in London was in this area, there were still large gaps in medical knowledge. Poverty-bred diseases rarely surprised the doctors of London Hospital. John Merrick's case came to the attention of Dr. Frederick Treves, later the physician of Edward VII. His account of the Merrick case is a classic in medical literature. The words are taken from his actual notes.
I first saw John Merrick, or the Elephant Man, as he became known, in November of 1884. One of my junior house surgeons had seen an exhibition of freaks in a disused warehouse off the Whitechapel Road, very near the London Hospital where I worked. The afternoon I went, I found the exhibition temporarily closed. I asked who the proprietor was and where I might find him. I sought him out, and we struck a bargain. He would give me a private showing for the payment of 1 shilling. We went into the warehouse, which was very cold, very dank. We went through numerous passages, up many stairs. Finally came to the room where John Merrick was sitting hunched in a corner.
There he is, Governor.
First, I couldn't quite see him. He was just a hunched figure in the distance. And as we got closer, he turned to me and revealed himself to be one of the most disgusting specimens of humanity it's ever been my misfortune to lay eyes upon. The proprietor said to him rather harshly, as if speaking to a dog,
"Stand up!"
This poor man stood up. You know, in my profession, As a doctor, I have seen many gross deformities and mutilations. But I can honestly say, never before or since have I seen a more pathetic, disgusting spectacle than poor John Merrick.
This is the skeleton.
The curator of the London Medical Museum, Percy Nunn, discusses the actual skeleton of John Merrick.
The fact that he had this terrifically grotesque appearance caused by the multiple growth of both bony tissue and also of the skin. Although he seems to be short in stature, this was attributed to the fact that he did have a scoliosis or curvature of the spine which reduced his height by at least 6 inches. And also the pelvic basin is twisted in such a manner that he became quite a cripple. He has this growth of bone on the head and down the right-hand side of the skeleton. The cast itself was taken when Merrick died, and the cast is a true replica of the way he looked during the time that he was alive. The jaw of the Elephant Man is inclined to the right, and it was here that the first formation of bony growth manifested itself about the age of 4.5 years. During the time he reached the age of 11, the whole of the head, including the forehead, began to show signs of these bony growths. This is a cast taken at death of the Elephant Man's left hand, as you see there. And you will notice that this is almost a normal hand, as against the right hand, which is here, and this is where the disease really took place. The right foot, which I have here, was also grossly deformed.
Dr. Treves recalls the disquieting effect John Merrick had on him.
I couldn't get the experience out of my mind. And I went back and I confronted the showman.
You don't seem to realise, if it hadn't been for me giving him employment, where would he be? He'd be in the workhouse shoveling stones. When I took him in, he had nothing. I took him in out of the kindness of my heart. I'm a kind-hearted man myself. I've been like a father to him.
No, I became very angry. I was disgusted with the way that poor John Merrick was living. He was living in absolute filth and squalor. And he was being exploited by this man. And time had come to do something about it. So we took him away. I decided after a while that the best course would be for me to provide John Merrick with a home of sorts and some sort of security. It wasn't altogether an altruistic decision. I, as an anatomist, wanted to study him from a medical point of view.
Dr. Treves admitted this man himself.
The head nurse remembers.
Which I found rather audacious of him, although I suppose he had his own reasons. Initially, I felt rather annoyed, well, very annoyed, in fact, because, in fact, it was irregular, most irregular. We have very strict rules here, made for very good reasons. One of our main rules is that we do not admit incurables. We just simply cannot afford the beds, nor our nurses' precious time. We have many casualties here. We have industrial accidents. We have to have a certain number of beds always vacant.
We provided him with a room in the London hospital. And he lived there, I think, in relative peace until he died.
When I saw the face for the first time, that's something I would rather forget, and I put it to the back of my mind because I was almost physically sick. And as a trained and experienced nurse, one is not proud of that. One has seen accidents, one has seen terrible sights. But this was something quite indescribable. One could not help being deeply affected by this case, this particular case, because here was a man we could have turned away, and here was someone that indeed we could help. He was incurable, but that doesn't mean to say you can't help people.
John Merrick lived for 3 years at the London hospital. Dr. Treves visited him often, constantly bringing books which opened up a magic world of make-believe to his patient, who began to construct miniatures which he proudly presented to visitors.
He must have had the most horrific mental troubles to bear, knowing what he looked like. I believe that his coming into our hospital helped not only himself, but all those around us. It widened our own experience. It certainly widened mine. And in the end, I felt rather ashamed of my initial reaction.
The circumstances of John Merrick's death were a little puzzling to us at the time. You see, John Merrick, because of the size of his head, had to sleep sitting up with his head resting on his knees. When we found him, he was lying flat on the bed, and as a consequence, he'd suffocated. Now, whether it was a deliberate act of suicide, or whether it was a pathetic attempt on his part to try to live some sort of a normal life and sleep like a normal human being, we will never know. But he was dead when we found him. And although it was tragic, and he'd made many friends while he was here at the London hospital, I felt that we'd made the last few years of his life a little better than it would have been if he'd remained where he was.
When John Merrick, the Elephant Man, died, he was thought to be a singular, hideous aberration of nature. Yet today, 100,000 people in the United States alone are victims of the Elephant Man disorder, neurofibromatosis. It is John Merrick's suffering that has called attention to their affliction, something society has tried to hide. How does anyone afflicted with this disorder cope with it today? The Elephant Man's disorder is discussed by Dr. Alan Rubinstein.
John Merrick, who was the Elephant Man, had an extraordinary case of neurofibromatosis with extensive overgrowth of tissues surrounding the neurofibromas. He really represents one end of a wide spectrum of this disorder. The disorder can range from a benign syndrome in which only a few lesions are present to people who have more severe involvement of the skin and more seriously growths of deeper areas of the body, which can lead to blindness, deafness, and spinal cord paralysis. Neurofibromatosis is not a rare disorder. The incidence is approximately 50 per 100,000, which means that 100,000 Americans are affected with this disorder. That makes it as common as muscular dystrophy or multiple sclerosis or other diseases which many people have heard of.
I started to get panicked when I was about in my 20s, late 20s, and I suddenly realized that something wasn't quite right.
Irene Smith has additional symptoms.
Ptosis. And then I started to get falling about, losing my sense of balance. They x-rayed my head, and they said I've got one growing on the 8th cranial nerve of the head, which is obviously going to throw me off my balance, and there's also one in my right ear. And that would also help me to lose my sense of balance. I never know I'm going to fall. I can be standing on the curb, go to take a step forward, and I'm flat on my face. When you go into a dress shop, you don't want the assistant in the cubicle with you. You say, no, thank you, I can manage on my own. Because you feel very embarrassed in case they think their dresses might be contaminated or something like that. And I'm very careful how I choose my dresses. I always make sure that I never buy a sleeveless dress or a see-through blouse or anything with a plunging neckline. I always make sure that my arms are either half covered or fully covered if I can. It's not always possible to get the clothes that you want, and I don't make my own clothes. Otherwise, I would always be going around dressed like a nun. Just because that's how you feel, that you want to cover yourself up as much as possible.
This 58-year-old man who demonstrates the most common lesion in neurofibromatosis, which is the dermal neurofibroma. They are usually multiple, more common on the torso, and usually break the skin and present as multiple nodules, which are usually painless. They can range in number from a few to literally thousands. These lesions are composed of nerve cells and fibrous tissue, hence the term neurofibroma. The disorder is genetic. It's a function of an abnormality in the chromosomes of an individual. The precise location of the abnormality and how to identify it are as yet undetermined.
Plastic surgery is a partial answer.
Over the past several years, we've done dozens of surgical procedures in which patients under general anesthesia has extensive removal of his skin lesions. And the results in general have been quite good.
I used to have many large ones, similar to those that I have on my body, on my face. And the foundation had a doctor, Simon, that a plastic surgeon, and he removed them, and it really picked me up a lot, changed my attitude a lot.
As a social worker, my primary concern is the impact
Penny Schwartz, Mount Sinai Hospital, New York.
of a genetic neurological disorder on patients' and families' lives. And one of the things that the NF Patient Family Group tries to do is to provide an atmosphere to talk about how they feel.
Do people ever say nasty things to
No,
you?
nobody has ever said anything nasty to me, but I do know and that people just are continually staring, and eventually, if the stare lasts for more than 5 or 10 seconds, you eventually do feel extremely self-conscious. I always had a very large, big red, floppy tumor on my left shoulder that I had had since birth, and as I was growing older, the tumor itself developed and grew. And to that point, I was very self-conscious about it. And when I used to go to the beach or any other place like that during the summer, where you could indeed go topless, I would always be very conscious of that and wear a very dark shirt so that the tumor would not show through.
My main area of frustration and concern is lack of knowledge on the part of physicians. I've known for some time what I have, but the physicians with whom I spoke and my family history all seemed to indicate that it was nothing more than neurofibromas. It wasn't until our 2 sons were born that I realized it was much more.
One doctor said to me, it's no big deal. I look at my son, he has tumors, and I feel so helpless, not being able to do anything. And at one point, I was getting upset over watching these tumors come out and not knowing how many or where they're going to hit. Now I pray that they don't hit in the vital areas. It is totally unpredictable. He has his years ahead of him where he has his puberty, he has his 20s to go through, his 30s. Nobody can tell me. And I can sit back and say, dear God, help me. There's nothing you can do. When the Elephant Man was playing in town, someone looked at me, a young boy, and looked at his friend and said, there's Mrs. Merrick. All of us know how important touch is. When people touch you, like that, how does it feel? Does it hurt physically sometimes?
Yes, it hurts when they touch me. It depends where they touch me or how hard they touch me, it hurts.
Sometimes I want to hug somebody, but looking like I am, I'm afraid to because I don't know how they will react.
What are you afraid will happen, Porter?
They will be repulsed. I've had people look at me and back away in horror.
It might not only be that they may feel repulsed, but they might feel that it's contagious, but it's not.
Like when we have a social gathering and people come in and they kiss each other, like I always kind of wait for them to approach me first. And if I see them approach me, then I can already tell the sign if they're going to approach me. If they don't, I just give them a smile and not make them feel uncomfortable.
I have a different perspective. I'm a parent. I don't have NF myself. But as I was listening to you and to Porter and to June before, and especially to June before, I had another thought, and it was that all of us, my daughter and you and June and Porter, are bigger than NF. And that's not the same thing as saying that it's nothing much. It is a great deal. But I know that if I give in to the anxiety, I could not live a contributing, happy life, and my daughter can't either. And so you have to go beyond that. My daughter is more than her neurofibromatosis. All of us are. And the fact that we are here and functioning and working shows this.
The legacy of the Elephant Man. The tragic life of the Elephant Man has attracted the attention of the world to his disorder.
The importance of research on neurofibromatosis extends far beyond the fact that 100,000 people have this disorder. The incidence of mental retardation, epilepsy, and cancer, three very common health problems in the United States, are much higher in people with neurofibromatosis than in the normal population. Research on the mechanisms by which neurofibromatosis produces these problems may very well lead to clues about these other major health problems.
The first purpose is to provide information.
Joan Rudd is president of the National Neurofibromatosis Foundation.
In the 100 years since Dr. von Recklinghausen first described neurofibromatosis, scant little has been learned about the disorder. Whatever progress, whatever information was learned about neurological diseases in general, there was no way for communication to be promoted internationally readily. The foundation seems to have filled that need. Doctors from all over the country and all over the world in all specialties have a structure within which to communicate.
For information concerning neurofibromatosis, write NF, 180 Riverside Drive, New York, New York, 10024. America's 16th president, Abraham Lincoln, was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth in 1865. 9 people were brought to trial. 5 were imprisoned. 4 were hanged. Only circumstantial evidence convicted the conspirators. Was justice done?
This series presents information based in part on theory and conjecture. The producer's purpose is to suggest some possible explanations, but not necessarily the only ones, to the mysteries we will examine.
Lincoln assassination historian, Professor William Hanchett.
Lincoln has been our most beloved president, and that means that we don't fully appreciate that at the time, during the Civil War, he was also our most hated president. And he was hated for 2 things. He was hated, first of all, for one of the things that he's most honored now, for freeing the slaves. But pro-slavery people, and Booth was certainly pro-slavery, thought that this was a terrible thing for the United States. The second thing for which Lincoln was hated by many people was his suppressions of civil liberty. So when Booth called Sic Semper Tyrannis after he shot Lincoln and jumped to the stage at Ford's Theater, he really believed that he was killing a tyrant. And, you know, killing a tyrant is no crime or no sin. During World War II, we would have respected somebody who killed Adolf Hitler. And many people, Booth among them, thought of Lincoln as we thought of Hitler.
John Wilkes Booth, a renowned actor in the South, sought worldwide fame that would last throughout history. An opportunity arose during the Civil War to serve both his ego and his beloved Confederacy with one dramatic act. September 1864, the plot was born.
It wasn't a conspiracy to assassinate from the beginning. Sometime late in the summer of 1864, Booth got the idea of kidnapping Lincoln and holding him ransom for the Confederate prisoners in United States prisoners of war camp. And he approached two of his boyhood friends, Samuel Arnold and Michael O'Laughlin, about it. They thought it was a feasible thing to do. Lincoln frequently drove around Washington without an escort.
At least
Lincoln historian and author of Murder at Ford's Theater, Mr. James O. Hall.
Now, I rather think that Booth was handed the kidnap plot in Boston about the end of July 1864, because he met there with 3 Confederate agents. Now, what they talked about, no one knows. But immediately after that, he started gathering together the people who would help him kidnap the president. And they had a meeting on the night of the 15th of March in which they were going to discuss this. They had this meeting at Gautier's restaurant on Pennsylvania Avenue. Booth, being in the theater, concluded that the kidnapping of Lincoln just had to be sensational. So he was going to kidnap him in Ford's Theater. They all gathered together and got a little drunk and got into an argument about how they were going to kidnap Lincoln. Arnold said he'd have no part of kidnapping a man in Ford's Theater, and O'Laughlin said it was suicide. But Booth insisted. The thing never came off, of course, in Ford's Theater.
March 17th, 1865, a kidnap attempt was made. Booth learned that Lincoln was going to attend a matinee performance of Still Waters Run Deep at the Soldiers' Home on the outskirts of Washington, D.C. Historical reports are mixed on what really happened. This version is based on lectures given by John Surratt, one of the conspirators. Booth led 2 of his men out of the city toward the hospital. They were armed and prepared to confront Lincoln's carriage during its return to Washington. Choosing a secluded spot on a deserted stretch of road, Booth left his men with instructions to await his signal for ambush, then rode out to track the carriage. As he prepared to give the signal, Booth discovered that the occupant of the carriage was not Lincoln, but Chief Justice Salmon P. Chase. Booth rode off and raged at his failure. Later, he was to learn that Lincoln had stayed in Washington and delivered a battle flag to the governor of Indiana from a balcony of the National Hotel. It was the hotel where Booth lived.
Then there was a change in Booth's plans, and I think it's probably fair to date it on April 11th, when Booth, in company with David Harold, who was one of the members of his group, and Louis Payne, another member, attended a lecture at the White House. And during this speech, Lincoln said that he was going to urge that some black men be given the vote. And Booth was outraged at this suggestion, and he turned to Payne right then and said, "Shoot him." And of course, Payne refused to do that, but then he turned to David Harold, the other companion, and said, "That's the last speech he'll ever make." So it's possible that then Booth did decide, if opportunity arose, that he would kill Lincoln.
So you see, whether the kidnapping plot just came over into a plot to murder, whether it was one conspiracy or two. You have to remember this, that any time anyone plans to kidnap a president of the United States, they must be prepared to kill. And they had armaments in the kidnapping plot. So it could be that this plan to kidnap Lincoln just drifted naturally in Booth's fanatical mind into a plot to murder.
April 14th, Booth knew that Lincoln would attend Ford's Theater that evening. He met with members of his group still in Washington.
It was only at this meeting that he told them that he was going to assassinate the president. And he gave Payne the assignment of killing Seward. He told Atzerodt to get Andrew Johnson. You see, Booth's plan was a massive conspiracy against the leadership of the government of the United States. The president, the vice president, the secretary of state, the secretary of war, and the general-in-chief. He may have believed that by killing the leaders of the United States, the Confederacy could still win its independence.
On April 13th, 1865, Booth wrote in his journal, "For 6 months we had work to capture, but our cause being almost lost, something decisive and great must be done." Though only a few of Booth's co-conspirators would now be involved in this plot to murder, everyone he had touched in the previous months would be tainted with guilt. John Wilkes Booth, self-appointed leader. Lewis Payne Powell, held prisoner by the Union. George Atzerodt, ferrying contraband across the Potomac. David Herold, a rather dull youth who followed Booth blindly. Michael O'Laughlin, Confederate deserter and boyhood friend of Booth. Edmund Spangler, stagehand at Ford's Theater. Samuel Arnold, Booth's schoolmate, former Confederate soldier. 8:30 p.m., April 14th. Lincoln is seated in his box at Ford's Theater. 9:30, Booth rides up Baptist Alley behind Ford's Theater, dismounts, and calls for Spangler to hold his horse. Instead, a boy, Peanut John Burrow, responds. Booth enters backstage and crosses to the adjoining Star Saloon. There, he orders whiskey and waits as the rest of the plot unfolds throughout the city. (10:03). Payne gains access to Secretary of State Seward's home. Seward was severely wounded, but would live. Payne had failed. Booth was determined to succeed. Booth enters the theater from the front, climbs to the balcony, crosses to the president's box. Being familiar with the play, he knows at exactly what point there will be sustained laughter and applause. Dr. John Latimer, historian, physician, and ballistics expert.
The actual pistol that Booth used to shoot President Lincoln was one like this, called a Derringer. A Derringer is a short-barrel gun firing a very large ball, and the velocity and the energy are very fatal if fired directly into the head. Being a single-shot pistol, of course, was useless after it fired its shot, and Booth then threw it down and pulled out his hunting knife, and when the Major Rathbone that was in the box with him grappled with him, he stabbed him badly in the arm. The Major staggered back, and Booth went over to the edge of the box and vaulted over onto the stage 12 feet below, a flamboyant, dangerous type of action that did indeed result in his breaking one of the small bones in his leg just above the ankle.
Booth ran from the theater and began his desperate ride towards freedom. He exited the alley with members of the audience in pursuit, rode down F Street, and across the Navy Yard Bridge into the Maryland countryside. Booth went to Soppers Hill to await David Herold. Herold was to lead Payne out of the city, but for reasons never explained, he arrived alone. From Soppers Hill, they went to Surrattville, arriving at the Surratt Tavern around midnight. Here, they were to pick up carbines, whiskey, and a pair of spyglasses. Mary Surratt, one of the accused conspirators, allegedly delivered these glasses for Booth on the morning of the assassination. 4 a.m., April 15th. Booth and Herold arrive at the home of Dr. Samuel Mudd. It is known that Mudd was acquainted with Booth. Whether he knew of Booth's deed remains a question. The broken leg was set and the boot was left behind. It was to become a damning piece of evidence. April 26th, federal troops captured Herold and cornered Booth at Garrett's farm. They set fire to the barn to smoke him out.
The barn was brilliantly illuminated. They could all see Booth very clearly. And Booth came back first towards the corner of the barn, and Booth then decided that he couldn't fight the blaze and started towards the front door with his crutch and a very heavy Spencer carbine, fully loaded, in one hand. And as he went towards the front of the barn, he pulled out one of his revolvers from his belt, and almost immediately a pistol shot rang out. And down went Booth, shot through the neck. Then they dragged him out and up to the back porch of the farmhouse, and he died within about 2 hours. The cry then went up, who shot him? Because, you know, they certainly wanted to capture him and have him for testimony, and here he was dead. And the man that stepped forward was Boston Corbett. One of the great questions is whether Boston Corbett actually shot John Wilkes Booth or whether Booth committed suicide. We know that the bullet hole through John Wilkes Booth's neck went slightly downhill, and we knew the bullet came in from his right, went downhill, going to the left. Now, this enormous pistol, if you try to shoot yourself that way in the neck, you find that your arm isn't long enough to make it easy to do in this manner, and they surely would have seen him do it. You have to switch it around, and you have to use your thumb if you're going to do this in order to press the trigger, in order to make it create the kind of wound that Booth had. So it seems very unlikely just on that basis alone that he shot himself. And if you're going to shoot yourself, to shoot yourself in the side of the neck would be the last place you would want to do it, because you might miss.
The question was asked, was it really Booth who had been shot?
At the autopsy, Dr. Woodward took some pains to be sure who he was autopsying. He had witnesses in who identified Booth, and he then described on Booth's hand his initials, which Booth himself had tattooed on them as a child in a scraggly, childish scrawl, but which were undoubtedly his.
Booth was buried in the old penitentiary. Another Booth was publicly dumped in the Potomac. Why? Secretary of War Edwin Stanton may have ordered this charade to dissuade grave robbers. He was to be questioned for many of his policies following the assassination. He had taken the reins of a crippled government, ordered hasty arrests of seemingly innocent people, rapidly convened a military trial, and ordered the prisoners to be held under tortuous conditions.
Nobody ever accused Stanton of involvement in the assassination until Otto Eisenschimel published that preposterous book, Why Was Lincoln Murdered, in 1937. It's almost a criminal case of loading the dice against Stanton, taking every circumstance, the most innocent ones, and giving them sinister implications. For example, it's frequently said that because Stanton ordered the men prisoners to be hooded so that they couldn't talk, that he was afraid that they would implicate him in the assassination. And this has been repeated time after time as one of the best indications that Stanton had something to hide. But it's ridiculous. The Stantons and the Lincolns were close to each other. Lincoln and Stanton respected each other. And you see, the misfortune is that in recent years, since 1937, it's just the exact opposite which has become known.
At Surratt, arrested April 14th. Michael O'Laughlin, Edward Spangler, and Samuel Arnold, arrested April 17th. Trial historian Edward Steers.
The trial was hampered by very serious legal questions, principal of which was due process. military tribunals and commissions, unfortunately, didn't really represent defendants' peers. And the rules of evidence were markedly changed during a military tribunal and commission. That's not to say that the outcome would have been any different than it was had they been tried in a civil court in the District of Columbia. But needless to say, it caused a great deal of difficulty.
Mary Surratt may have been convicted only to serve as bait for her son, John, a primary suspect. The Surratt Society was formed to preserve her memory. Society President Joan Chaconas.
There were actually three things that convicted Mrs. Surratt, I suppose, in the trial. One was the fact that she knew Booth. Her son introduced his mother to the actor John Wilkes Booth. He would come to the house to visit the son. If the son wasn't there, then he'd stop and chat with the ladies. And of course, this was all brought out during the trial that Booth was there, and if he didn't talk with the son, John, then he was talking to Mrs. Surratt, and what did they talk about? Whether she knew exactly what he was doing is questionable. However, if you're a mother today with a teenage son, you might have a suspicion that he's doing something that possibly he shouldn't be doing, but you probably don't think it's going to come to any evil or any harm. The second thing was Lewis Thornton Powell, the fellow who was told by Booth to go and kill the Secretary of State Seward. Well, unfortunately for Mrs. Surratt, just as the soldiers are at her house downtown questioning her about the whereabouts of her son, John Jr., and John Wilkes Booth, who should come knocking at the door but Lewis Thornton Powell? And the soldier in the house, detectives, they answer the door and wonder, who is he? What's he doing here? And he says, well, he came here because Mrs. Surratt wanted him to dig a ditch for her the next morning. This seemed very strange, and Mrs. Surratt was called to come out here and identify this man, and she said she didn't know who he was.
The most damning evidence came from John Lloyd, keeper of the Surratt Tavern.
The evidence that John Lloyd gave was that Mrs. Surratt gave him a message to have some shooting irons ready. Some people were coming by later to pick them up, and she gave him a package to deliver to those same people. Whether she knew what was in the package, this supposedly contained Booth's spyglasses. She didn't know what was in that package. These are all things that are based on circumstances, and there's nothing really, no concrete evidence to show that she really had anything to do or any knowledge that Booth was planning to kill the president.
5 members of the commission met and signed a clemency plea on behalf of Mary Surratt, asking Johnson to commute her sentence to life imprisonment. Holt maintains that on July 5th, when he presented the findings to Johnson, he also showed him the clemency plea, and that Johnson ignored it or turned it down. Johnson maintains that he never saw the clemency plea and was totally unaware of it, and upheld the final sentences as recommended by the commission.
July 7th, 1865.
The hangman was getting tired of taking this very stiff rope and making 8 turns on every one of the men's knots, and by the time he got to Mrs. Surratt, since he didn't think it would be used, he only put 5 turns on her knot. And then, to his horror, the knot was indeed used to hang her.
Mary Surratt became the first woman to be hanged by the federal government. Did Booth go to Dr. Mudd's only for medical assistance? Some say Mudd also gave provisions. This could not be proven. Mudd was sentenced to life in prison on evidence that Booth's knee-high boot was found at his home. How many others were convicted on circumstantial evidence?
It was the government's position that all of these individuals participated in the conspiracy to varying degrees, but all of them shared equally in the guilt of the murder of President Lincoln. Stanton, when he issued his order on May 6th, charging the formation of the military commission, had used the phrase that the commission was to remove the stain of innocent blood from the land. And I think, in fact, that's what the final sentencing was doing.
Were the right people brought to trial? Could others have conspired to kill Abraham Lincoln? John Wilkes Booth pulled the trigger in the assassination of Lincoln. There was a conspiracy involved. Some of the details of that conspiracy may for all time remain cloaked in mystery. In 1895, H.G. Wells published a fantastic novel about time travel. He entitled it The Time Machine. The book ushered in a fanciful era of imaginary trips to awe-inspiring events of history. '79 A.D., the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. '26 A.D., the resurrection of Christ. '15 billion B.C., the very creation of the universe. Today, science is reshaping our concept of the cosmos. Are we at last ready to journey to the stars and conquer the barriers of time and space travel?
This series presents information based in part on theory and conjecture. The producer's purpose is to suggest some possible explanations, but not necessarily the only ones, to the mysteries we will examine.
We are witness to the last leg of a hypothetical journey to the stars and back again. Our crew has been traveling through the galaxy very near the speed of light. They have finally returned to Earth. Due to an effect called time dilation, first described by Albert Einstein, hundreds of years have passed on Earth, while only a few years have passed in the spaceship. Once they have landed, what will the crew find when they open the portal of their ship? Will Earth have reached undreamed heights of technology or seared itself back into Stone Age emptiness? It is easy to conceive of the astronauts' journey through space. It is harder to comprehend their travel through time. How far-fetched is the idea of actually traveling through time? Today, we accept the concept of distant space travel because we have journeyed to the moon and back. Now, scientists are preparing for a world where both time and space travel are inseparably linked.
Status check. Command on intel? Affirmative.
One expert on the subject of time and space is William Kaufman, author, lecturer, and adjunct professor in the Department of Physics at San Diego State University.
We all live in space and time. We're all familiar with the three dimensions of space, forward and back, left and right, up and down. And time is what clocks measure. As the clock ticks on, it's measuring time. And of course, as we go from the cradle to the grave, you're also moving through time. It's kind of like looking up at the stars. When you look up at the stars during the night, you see stars scattered across the sky. If you think about what you're seeing, if you look at a star that's 10 light years away, you're really seeing how that star looked 10 years ago because it took the light 10 years to get to you. And therefore, to me, one of the great lessons of the nighttime sky is that as we are looking out into space, we're also looking backwards in time, that we must incorporate time on an equal footing with our three dimensions of space and talk about something that we call space-time, one of the things that was given to us by Albert Einstein.
Albert Einstein changed all conventional thinking in physics when he published his famous Theory of Relativity in 1905.
E is equal mc square, in which energy is per equal to mass multiplied with the square of the velocity of light, showed that very small amount of mass may be converted into a very large amount of energy.
Albert Einstein approached all of reality with a deep personal conviction, almost a religious belief, that if we're doing anything right in science, if we're discovering anything of any real value, then the way we write down our discoveries, the way we write down our equations, should not depend on things like the color of your skin or your religion or how fast you happen to be moving, whether you're sitting here on the Earth or zooming through the solar system at 3/4 the speed of light. And all Einstein did in 1905 was take everything we knew about electricity and magnetism and rewrite it in a form such that it would be the same for everyone. For an example, suppose you have a rocket ship moving through the solar system at 3/4 of the speed of light. In order for you on Earth and your colleague in that spaceship to have a complete, coherent, rational understanding of how things work, you have to say his rulers are shrinking. You have to say that the very mass of his spaceship is behaving as though it's much more massive than it normally is. You have to say his clocks are ticking more slowly than normal. Not only do the clocks tick more slowly, but every process proceeds more slowly, like the rate at which a man's beard grows, or the rate at which your heart beats, or even the rate at which you age. One of the results of all of this is that you can't travel faster than the speed of light. And the reason why this is so is if you think about moving out in a rocket ship, say a rocket ship even with an infinite supply of fuel, as that rocket ship goes faster and faster and faster, its clocks slow down. And as a result, it burns that fuel more and more slowly. And the slowing down of time is so powerful that at the speed of light, clocks stop, time stops. And as a result, you never are able to burn that final drop of fuel, that final precious drop of fuel that would put you over the speed of light. While Albert Einstein was exploring many of the hypothetical and mathematical aspects of space and time, people in the United States and in Germany were actually building machines to take us up off of the surface of the Earth.
Early experiments in rocketry appear almost comic compared to today's accomplishments in space. But improvements in rocket design came rapidly, especially in America under Robert Goddard, and in Germany with the work of Wernher von Braun. By 1932, von Braun had taken charge of Germany's rocket program and had begun the tests that would lead to the infamous V-2 missiles. During World War II, Adolf Hitler used the V-2 rocket as a weapon of terror against the civilian population of London.
For better or for worse, rockets have always had a military application. But underlying all of this, in the minds of everyone who works on these projects, is the vision of using these machines to take us beyond the confines of our own planet, to explore the moon. We've walked on the lunar surface, to use reusable rocket ships like the Space Shuttle, to make many trips, to make use of the full potential of what actually exists out there in space. And you know, perhaps not us, but our children may very well be able to book flights to space stations or to the moon and beyond.
One group that hopes to be among the first to utilize the Space Shuttle when it opens up to civilians calls itself Oasis. They gather together on weekends to share food and their enthusiasm for space travel.
I'm Charlie Carr, and I'm with the California Museum of Science and Industries. This group is doing something that's really unique. It's getting together a lot of people from different backgrounds, from technical fields, from social fields, people working in the community, all different sorts of people, and they're all thinking and talking about space. They're talking about what's going to happen in the future, talking about what's going to happen personally to their lives as more people on Earth move out into space.
A frequent lecturer to the group is Dr. B.J. Bluth, sociologist and expert on long-duration space flight.
The work that I do really focuses in on how people can live in space, how they can get along together, what kinds of general problems, stresses, factors make it easier and harder for them to have a viable, successful mission. The human is going to have certain kinds of problems when he goes to space. There are stresses, there are physiological problems, there are fears, there are incidents that occur, there's the interpersonal relationship, there's being holed up all alone, no place to go, no way to get away. If you can imagine yourself being in a camper with no privacy curtains, with another person for 6 months and no place to go and you can't walk out of the camper, what kinds of things happen in that kind of situation? We have a very human problem in going to space. The technology is only one aspect. And if the human part of this space travel isn't as carefully solved as the technology problem, all of the technology in the world isn't going to make it possible to do what we want to do.
Obviously, there are a lot of technical problems with space travel. It's a difficult business getting someone there and back and healthy and sane during the process. But there's another whole aspect to this business. Because sitting around in the scientific journals for the past 15 or 20 years now have been things like time machines and time tunnels, wormholes in space, highly warped regions of space where you could go in someplace in our universe and come out in another universe, or go in one of these holes and come out back in our own universe at a different time, 1 billion years ago or 1 billion years in the future. And these are some of the most fantastic, hypothetical things that science has ever given us.
In our future explorations of the galaxy, will we one day make the discovery that will fulfill H.G. Wells' dream of time travel? Will we find the mechanism to travel backwards and forwards through time? I am afraid I cannot convey the peculiar sensations of time traveling. There is a feeling of helpless, headlong motion. As I put on pace, night followed day like the flapping of a black wing. So wrote H.G. Wells in 1895 in his incredible novel, The Time Machine. Wells described a machine of brass, ebony, ivory, and translucent glimmering quartz. It was designed to take man on a journey through time. Wells clearly understood the implication of traveling backwards and forwards through the centuries and depicted it as a wonderful adventure. In an effort to accurately predict the future, H.G. Wells strove to utilize the latest scientific theories of his day. A strong proponent of the theory of evolution, Wells suggested that the environment of industrialized England would cause the factory workers to evolve into what he called Morlocks. The Morlocks were pale, pink-eyed, carnivorous creatures who inhabited underground caverns of complex machinery. Wells saw a different fate for those who lived the life of leisure in society. After thousands of years of living without need or conflict, Wells proposed that they would evolve into what he called the Eloi. The Eloi were childlike creatures of limited intelligence who would frolic and gather fruit on the surface of the earth. Today, the evolutionary prophecies of H.G. Wells seem to many unlikely. But is it possible that someday science may actually build a time machine?
Having a time machine is a very attractive idea. We all have things we'd like to go back and change about our lives or maybe affect history somehow. But scientists have trouble with time machines. There are a lot of illogical inconsistencies that develop. For example, if you had a time machine that could take you back 1 billion years in the past, well, then you should certainly have no difficulty going 5 minutes back into the past. And if you could go back 5 minutes, you could meet yourself and tell yourself, literally, what kind of a nice trip you had. And then both of you could do the same thing. And then all 4 of you could do it. And then all 8 of you could do it. In other words, there's an inherent inconsistency that suddenly comes up. If you could travel back into the past, then reality must be irrational. There must be a very irrational part to how the universe works. And we don't see this going on around us. And for this reason, when scientists find time machines popping up in their calculations, a lot of flags go up and they begin suspecting that they've done something wrong.
If there is any chance of a time travel mechanism existing, it will probably be found in distant space. Some scientists believe that when a giant red star explodes, the remaining core may collapse down to an incredibly dense ball of matter called a black hole. The gravitational field around a black hole is so intense that not even light can escape it.
The full description of how black holes work also include white holes. The full description actually is a set of black holes and white holes back to back. What's a black hole for one universe where things fall in is a white hole in the next universe where stuff gushes out. But the interesting thing in all of these pictures where you have a black hole, white hole situation is that if you take into account the effects of rotation on the black hole, the entire structure inside the black hole change. In particular, one of the things to come out of this, theoretically, is that you could possibly use this black hole as a portal, as a time tunnel from our universe to some future universe, or perhaps even some past universe.
Such a journey into a black hole would be fraught with dangers.
If you can go through that wormhole in space and time, then you can travel very, very near the center of the hole. You can travel very near where the matter of the star collapsed down to, where you have this tremendous curvature, this high warping of space and time. And there are problems with that. For example, if you could travel very near that place where you have infinite space-time warping, according to Einstein's famous equation E=mc², the energy in the gravitational field of the hole produces a lot of matter that fills up the wormhole and chokes off any possibility of space travel to future universes. And this is one of the ways in which we think nature prohibits time machines. Nature takes care of things and makes sure that things won't come out too irrational by having a time machine. It chokes off the possibility of getting through the wormhole.
Perhaps the tunnel through a black hole will forever remain blocked, but the possibility always remains that someday someone will make a discovery which will allow us to visit Earth's distant past or glittering future. Carol Amato has a background in social science and is a member of OASIS. She has a special plan for accomplishing her goal of space travel.
I use the computer in my work, and I'm hoping that by doing so, this will provide a career path for me to get into space. My children I'm trying to prepare just by being adaptive to new situations. Tracy has a tremendous interest in growing things, plants and baby animals. I'm hoping she'll take this interest into space because it's going to be necessary to want to nurture things in order to make the environment be a psychologically pleasing one and to recreate something of the Earth. Damon's a very active boy. I hope he can utilize that energy that he has in some constructive way. Maybe he can go into space and become one of the pioneers.
With the successful flight of the space shuttle and the likelihood of civilian space travel on the horizon, it is not difficult to imagine families like Carol Amato's someday traveling into space. Perhaps one day, a boy Damon's age will solve the mystery of what lies on the other side of a black hole or at the place beyond the stars. What are the limitations of the galaxy? Will we ever travel faster than the speed of light, or backward and forward through time?
I don't think that any scientist would categorically say, no, we will never travel faster than the speed of light. No, we'll never have time travel. But if we ever do, then this would have to come from a whole new view of science, a new super science, whereby we understand today's limitations as one separate little case. In other words, the kind of science that would give us travel into the past or travel faster than the speed of light would be as advanced over us today as we are over Neanderthal man.